What's up, guys? You're listening to a February 11th edition of the Splash Egg Podcast. Today, this is going to be another quick monologue where I'm going to talk about some things, a couple things NBA. Had a decent amount I wanted to speak on when it came to college basketball. So, without further ado, I'll get right to it. Once again, I'm trying to eliminate my use of the word and other filler words. So, I'm going to try to keep myself accountable in that department. So let's start with the NBA. So last night I actually got around to watching a little bit of Heat Warriors. Got to see the cool little tribute that they did for Andre Iguodala. The Warriors, obviously because of the time that he spent there. And there were so that was cool to just see Clay give the speech and the little tribute video they did. Given how much Andre Iguodala means to that dynasty, that organization, it was really cool to see. And upon thinking about what Andre Iguodala contributed to the Warriors, just made me think about how you're never going to pick up, not never, I should say, but the casual person would not pick up a stat sheet and go, wow, Andre Iguodala is a monster. Andre Iguodala should be an all-star. Andre Iguodala is a this, and this. But and I know it's a little cliche, but he really brings a lot of the smarts and intangibles, especially on the defensive side of the ball, as well as offensive. On the offensive end, a lot of his playmaking, his passes, he has very crisp and timely decision making. So I say all that to say, Andre Iguodala to me is the embodiment of someone where the statistics may not flash up on the screen for you, but when you watch the games, you understand how important he is to winning. And I would say he's one of the all-time, when it comes to the players of the 2010s, he's got to be up there when it comes to guys who are true winners, because you think about everything that he sacrificed, something that people get on Carmelo's case about is the fact that he was unwilling to come off the bench, whereas Andre Iguodala prior to the 2014-15 season had never come off the bench, and he was very receptive to that. And some of that credit obviously goes to Steve Kerr for, being able to get Iguodala to buy in, but I really think that Andre Iguodala should be in the Hall of Fame. I don't want to talk too much about legacy and whatnot, but to me, a guy like Andre Iguodala is the quintessential winner, and I don't think you can tell the story of the NBA, especially not in the 2010s, without Andre Iguodala. And one thing that I always think is a really interesting and good litmus test for what people value when it comes to basketball is I ask them, would you rather have Vince Carter's career or Andre Iguodala's? And to me, I always say that I would personally rather have Andre Iguodala's, and here's why. Both of them, so let's take the money out of it, because both of them, though Vince made more money through contracts, at the end of the day, when you make that much money, you're going to be fine. You have you have the financial security as long as you don't do anything, as long as you don't waste it away. You have the financial security for you, your kids, your grandkids, and their kids and whatnot. So to me, money is not influencing this decision. It's not like I'm choosing between being an NBA player who, I don't know, was on a couple 10 days, maybe got a non-guaranteed, versus like a guy who made a couple million. In this case, I'm not really factoring in the money. Vince had a lot more popular acclaim. Obviously, he was a multiple-time All-Star, and obviously the statistics and the resume suggest that Vince is the better individual player. But what do you think about when you think about Vince's big career moments? And I'm not shitting on Vince or anything, but what I'm saying is, to me personally, I think that Andre Iguodala not only contributed more to winning, partially because he was in the right situation to be a role player on a dynasty. But that said, to me, what I value the most is what I would value more, as opposed to, say, winning dunk contests and being in multiple All-Star games and having the highest selling jersey and things like that. To me, what I value most is being able to play as many games on the biggest and highest stage. And to me, and that's the NBA Finals, obviously. Andre Iguodala got to do that 5 times. And not only that, it wasn't like he was sitting on the bench. He was a key integral part of 5 finals teams, 3 NBA champions, one of the modern day NBA dynasties, and obviously won a Finals MVP. Meanwhile, Vince Carter in his Nets and Raptors days never got to a conference finals. By the end of the Nets days, I think he was past his prime, obviously. He didn't make an All-Star game after 2007. And then he got to a conference finals in 2010 with the Orlando Magic as a starter, not an All-Star, nothing. And so he never got past the conference finals. And I know you can make the argument, Iguodala, when he was the guy in Philly, he never got past the second round, etc. And that's all fair. But to me personally, I would rather go through the motions of Iguodala's career, playing in the finals, being a two-way force, incredibly smart, savvy veteran on a dynasty, things like that. And to me, I would put him in the Hall of Fame, though if they don't, whatever, to me, he is a guy that I think future generations could really benefit by studying and watching film of. So those are some quick thoughts on Andre Iguodala. The 2020 NBA All-Star weekend is coming up. I was really excited for the Rising Stars game, although a little disappointed that my guy Tyler Hero unfortunately is injured. I didn't get to see him last night because he was hurt against the Warriors. So it looks like he's sitting, and I think he is going. Who's he getting replaced by? Let me see. Who's he getting replaced by? Colin Sexton. Yeah. But the league is in really good hands. When you look at these Rising Stars rosters, the league is in some good hands, on the world team and the U.S. team. You got Zion, Trae Young, Tyler Hero, John Morant, as Jaren Jackson Jr. as guys that I could see being future stars, superstars, all-stars, let's say. And then obviously guys like P.J. Washington, Kendrick Nunn, Devontae Graham have all shown a lot of promise, as well as Eric Pascal, Miles Bridges, Devontae Graham. Meanwhile, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander on the world team looks like a future all-star. Brandon Clark looks like he's going to be in the ideal situation, he's going to be the third best guy on a title team, on like a dynastic team, not dynastic team, but like a title contention team with Jaren Jackson and John Morant, and he's going to be the perfect defensive big who can switch all 5 positions, rim run, catch lobs, super athletic, and also can play in the modern NBA because he's only, I think, maybe 6'7", 6'8", and so he's got the foot speed and the athleticism to keep up with. So he is just the prototypical small ball 5 where I could see in 6 or so years the Grizzlies being title contenders, maybe even sooner, who knows, but I love watching Brandon Clark play, as well as a guy like Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who I think, ironically, cousins with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. I got to see him live actually a couple times when he was at Virginia Tech, but I've always been very impressed by his ability his ambidexterity is what really impresses me, and he just seems, even though he's not quote unquote like a knockdown shooter, he's a good enough shooter to be on the floor, and though he's not a true quote-unquote point guard, I've always been impressed with the fact that he can always make a play or get to the bucket, and that is something that I'd like to see for a combo guard like himself, where he can kind of float in and out, not in and out, but sorry, he can navigate both guard positions in the NBA, whether they're playing, a lineup with him next to, say, Jrue Holiday. He can play more off the ball, but I also could see him being a guy who could play more with the ball in his hands as well. And then obviously Luka Doncic, already in the MVP conversation, I would say. I'd say he's probably in the top 5. The Mavs are not quite good enough in terms of title contention for him to be there, but nobody can say, even the biggest Luka fans couldn't say that they expected Luka to be doing what he's doing this year. So And speaking of Luka and the Mavs, apparently the Mavs might have one of the first or second highest offensive, depending on how these next couple games go. They could potentially swing into becoming the best, having the highest offensive rating in the NBA ever, which would be absolutely nuts. So, a lot of credit goes to Rick Carlisle for understanding what he has in Luka and just saying, hey, everything, essentially what's James Harden doing in Houston? We're basically going to give you the ball every time and everything runs through you. But I would argue that he's just a little more he's a little more fun to watch because it's a little less of everybody standing around and a little less of a calculated math or science behind it. That's about it I have. Actually, no, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other stuff. I guess on this year I'm planning on watching the All-Star Saturday night. Curious, I haven't watched. I don't think I've watched very. I don't watch the competitions as closely as I used to, but curious to see. I like how they mix up the skills challenge to have bigs and guards, or bigger players as well as guards. The dunk contest. It's heartbreaking to hear Dwight talk about how Kobe was going to help him out, and yeah, that's a tough one to talk about. But I'll definitely curious to see what Dwight does, as well as Aaron Gordon, who obviously had that epic dunk contest with Zach LaVine a couple years back, and then there's the 3-point contest, which honestly, in some ways is the more appealing game or event of All-Star Saturday night these days in today's day and age. But as for the two teams, Team LeBron versus Team Giannis, I watched the draft live, and well, first off, the starters just ended up being the conferences. Like Giannis drafted the East starters and LeBron drafted the West starters. Maybe I'm gonna eat absolute crow for saying this, but I thought LeBron was a better GM. Giannis, he took a lot of big guys, and I feel like there were times where he didn't quite take the best guy on the board. Just my opinion. Although Giannis, what I did like about Giannis was he did have a little international flavor where he took, well, obviously he has himself, Siakam, Embiid, and then he also took Gobert. Just a lot of international big men. I guess he just couldn't quite get to Jokic and Simmons, and Sabonis, I guess. But I don't know. I feel like LeBron's team. Well, I mean, they got Harden, AD, Kawhi, Luka. They got Dame on the bench, Russ as well, and they got playmakers like Jokic, CP. So I don't know. I personally felt like Giannis or LeBron had a better draft than All-Star draft than Giannis, but who knows? We'll see who wins the game. I like what they're doing in terms of change. I don't know if I love what they're doing, but I do like the fact that they did change up the format to try to pay tribute to Kobe, and hopefully the guys will play harder, because there are times where sometimes you watch the All-Star game and it's like, okay, what are we really doing here? It's load management within the game, which I understand, but sometimes the product itself has kind of sucked. I'm really thinking of 2017, where the NBA All-Star game was not particularly fun to watch. 2018 was actually pretty solid, and last year was decent. But anyhow, now I'm gonna move on to college basketball. Actually, I'm lucky enough to go to the UVA Notre Dame game tonight, but this past weekend, it was the first weekend where there was no football, or not no football, but it was the first Saturday after football, or weekend after the NFL season concluded. The NBA had just had their trade deadline, and there was a lot that happened on this past Saturday when it came to college basketball. And I think that the Duke-UNC game really put a lot of eyes on back onto college basketball. Now, I'm going to hit on a couple quick college basketball thoughts. So let's start with Duke Carolina. Let's start with Duke Carolina. So obviously, I have made my feelings clear in the past. Nothing personal. I just don't like Trey Jones, the basketball player. Nothing against him as a human being or anything. But and this is where I'll be a little biased for sure, but in that moment on Saturday, the fact that he missed the second free throw in regulation and in overtime, and his team somehow benefited from it, obviously a little heartbreaking for myself as someone watching. Also, I really felt like UNC getting that win. First off, that's obviously the biggest game of their season, considering they have a very slim shot of making the NCAA tournament, which I'll actually talk about in a little bit. But to see Cole play well and that whole team play and kind of be a little bit like the team a lot of people thought they could have been in the preseason, for them to be in control that whole game and then lose in that heartbreaking fashion, it's tough, because on top of that, they also now don't have they lose a marquee win that they should have had on their resume, which would have really helped for their case to make the NCAA tournament. But besides that, obviously I've stated how I feel about Trey Jones. He showed incredible poise. What else can I say? The fact that they just kind of consistently kept playing, and he never seemed too rushed or anything. And another thing I noticed about UNC was that they were comfortably up, say 5, 7, 8 in like the final minute or two, and it felt like they were because Duke had hit a couple of threes to kind of give themselves a breathing chance. It seemed like they were so insistent on not letting Duke hit another three that they just kind of kept letting Trey Jones get to the basket, which was a little frustrating for me as someone who was rooting for Carolina in that game. But is what it is. I have never been more sad about a Carolina loss to Duke ever. As a kid, I actually rooted for Duke over Carolina. I remember when Jabari Parker beat on the last game of the regular season when they beat Carolina. That was a great moment. I remember watching that game and being very excited. But so, as for the game itself, though incredibly wild in terms of the finish and like whoa, how the hell did that just happen? And being a very entertaining game, it was a very sloppy game. A lot in part due to the fact that Carolina was on top of offensively. They were going for most of the game, but then towards the end, obviously, they missed a lot of free throws, but on top of that, it just seemed like, first off, they fouled. Every time Duke came near the basket, they kind of panicked and would foul a lot. So a lot of their guys had to foul out. I think Leaky Black fouled out, as did Baycott fouled out as well. Meanwhile, on top of that, it was not exactly the prettiest game, but it was a very entertaining game, and it definitely was a redeeming game for the college basketball season that made people say, okay, the college basketball season is back, and, March is coming around. So that was that. As for, I touched earlier on the case for UNC and how it's unlikely that they make the NCAA tournament. And here's what I will say to that. I did a little bit of research. Today I'm going to be pulling up historical teams in the past, and maybe see if I can draw some potential conclusions about current teams. So this UNC Tar Heels team, so the selection committee will consider the fact that they did miss a bunch of games they did not have Cole Anthony for about a month and a half-ish. So not that those games are totally disregarded, but that is considered if they do start rolling with Cole Anthony back in the lineup. However, right now the problem is they have 13 losses already. So I did a little bit of research. What is the most number of losses an at-large bid team has had in the past? So this is me assuming that the Tar Heels will not win the ACC tournament, which honestly, the ACC is not at its best this year, partially due to Carolina being down, but the ACC is not some murderer's rush. So Carolina could win the ACC tournament. But let's assume that we're talking at large, right? Right now they're 10-13 and 3-9 in the ACC. Yikes. But that means they have 8 games remaining, and there are 2 teams in the past that have had 15 15 losses and entered the NCAA tournament, ironically, both as 9 seeds and both were from the SEC. That's the 2016-17 Vanderbilt team, as well as the 17-18 Alabama team. Now, if for those of you that might remember, that Alabama team actually had that Alabama team had Colin Sexton, and in some ways, you could say there are some similarities. That Alabama team ended the regular season on a 5-game losing streak. On top of that, they didn't have any great wins except for a win over an NCAA tournament team in Texas A&M, a win over Auburn, a win over Oklahoma, and then Florida and Tennessee, right? Now, the problem with the Tar Heels is I don't know if they're going to be able to have that many quality wins. But they headed into the SEC tournament on a 5-game losing streak, which put them at 17-14, 8-10 in the SEC. And then they ended up winning 2 games in the SEC tournament over tournament teams, A&M, which was a 7 seed that year, and then Auburn, which ended up being a 4 seed. Ironically, the Vanderbilt team that I mentioned also finished the year 17-14, and then also once again won 2 games in the SEC tournament before losing to another team. So here's what I'm saying: for Carolina to make the NCAA tournament, I think that they would need to let's assume they're going to lose 1 game in the ACC tournament. That means they can only take 1 more loss in their next 8 regular season games. Now, their next 8 regular season games are at Wake, Virginia at home, at Notre Dame, at Louisville, NC State at home, at Syracuse, Wake Forest again, and at Duke. If they lose just 1 game, and let's say they win all their games except for the game at Duke, that would give them a win over Virginia, 2 wins over NC State, a win at Syracuse, close loss to Duke, Florida State, as well as a win over Oregon from earlier in the year. That would at least keep them on the bubble, considering that Cole Anthony was out for a decent amount, right? So keep that in mind. So they would head into the year. Once, like those 2 previous teams I mentioned, they would head into the conference tournament 17-14. And if that were the case, they would just need to make sure they pick up 1 more quality win and don't have an embarrassing loss to a non-tournament team in the ACC tournament. Now, would I bet on this Carolina team doing it? No, but if they really did figure something out in that game against Duke and they do start to click a little more, Cole Anthony starts to not force himself nearly as much. I could definitely see that. I could definitely see Carolina at least being in the conversation and making a push for that. However, if they lose 2 more regular season games, so these next 8 games, if they lose 2 of them, then they have to win. I think they have to win the ACC tournament in order to get in. Otherwise, they would have 16 losses heading into Selection Sunday, and that would be kind of hard to justify, especially considering their advanced metrics don't rate as well as 2017 Vanderbilt or 2018 Alabama. So those are just some of my thoughts on, does UNC have a chance? Couple quick things, other things I wanted to discuss. The selection committee revealed the top 16, and there weren't very many surprises. I do think one thing that is interesting is that the committee put Gonzaga over San Diego State. So that means assuming both teams win out, that would mean that I would assume that means that Gonzaga would remain ahead of San Diego State. So that's just interesting. That's an interesting thing to keep in mind going forward. I was a little surprised to see West Virginia at the 2. Granted, they ended up losing literally later that day. So as a result, I would assume that Maryland hopped into that last spot at the 2 line. I'd be curious to see. just seeing the bracket reveal got me so excited because I'm so ready for Selection Sunday when they finally announce who's gonna be playing where and whatnot. But there's obviously still a lot of basketball still to be played. About 4 more weeks of the regular season, and then obviously championship week. So that is that. I'm thinking I might do a mock selection podcast. Also, quick thought on Duke again. To go back to Duke Carolina real quick. This Duke is obviously on the list of teams that can win the national championship. They've beaten a lot of good teams, and generally speaking, they don't fumble down the stretch. That's one thing I do have to give credit to Coach K. His teams always seem prepared and poised. Sometimes, obviously, they do get the benefit of the whistle, but at the end of the day, that's part of what Coach K's influence on the game is that he has been able to build. This is needless to say, by building a brand as big as Duke, he's and becoming the legend that he is. He has an influence sometimes over the officiating. Sometimes, a lot of times it goes his way. Occasionally it doesn't, but that's that. But the thing about Duke, and I think this is obviously true for a lot of teams this year, is that given some of Duke's losses and the fact that they almost lost to a UNC team that many people don't think is particularly good. Granted, I will give them this. In rivalry games in college, a lot of times teams play at their best, like better than they normally are. So if they want to argue that they were playing a better version of Carolina at their absolute best, I'll give them that. But that said, Duke, though it could very well be a Duke year where no one's a lead and Duke ends up as a 1 or a 2 seed and they kind of walk their way to the Final Four, and hey, they beat some good teams just as they've done all year. But another thing is that if I'm a low major, I'm talking like a 15, 16, 14 seed, I'm not scared of Duke. I think that Duke is as great as they are, and they've handled most of the teams that they've played. I'm not scared of Duke if I'm some low seed, if I'm some lower seeded team. That's all I'll say. I'll talk about that. I'll keep curious to see who they end up playing, what their path to Atlanta ends up looking like. Some other quick thoughts. It looks, as with each passing game, San Diego State looks more and more convincing as one of the best teams in college basketball. And on top of that, it looks like they're going to run the table. I'm hoping they do, because that makes for a very interesting subplot to monitor going into the NCAA tournament. And the last two teams, I've been lucky enough to see 2014 Wichita State and 2015 Kentucky enter NCAA tournament undefeated. So here's what I will say. This San Diego State team is obviously not as good as that 2015 Kentucky team. That 2015 Kentucky team, even though they didn't win the championship, is honestly the best college team I've ever seen. But I was curious, how do they compare resume-wise to the 2014 Wichita State team? Because I remember heading into the 2014 tournament, there were a lot of skeptics who were there were a lot of people who thought Wichita State, they didn't really play a tough schedule, yada, yada, yada. And ironically, it was the fact that they kept it really close with an 8-seeded Kentucky team that was hella talented and stacked, just couldn't figure it out till March, and ended up going to the title game. The fact that Wichita State almost beat that team, that early exit, ironically, I think actually made people respect Wichita State more. But looking at KenPom, the San Diego State team has a better defense by about adjusted defense by about 2.5 points, exactly 2.5 points per 100 possessions, and then an adjusted offense that is about 1.5 points worse than Wichita State. On top of that, their strength of schedule, Wichita State's was not great. It was their non-con was 79th, although San Diego State's is actually, sorry, no, I'm looking at this wrong. Yeah, so I don't know. So Ken Palm's adjusted non-conference strength of schedule was 79th for Wichita State and 205th for San Diego State. And that actually checks out because I was doing research and I was going to compare the two. I think Wichita State was 6th in Ken Palm and then San Diego State right now is 5th in Ken Palm, but once again, different years, so you're going against different competition. So I was looking at it and I was thinking, okay, let's compare the two non-conference resumes because I think their conference resumes, the Mountain West is a little better than that Missouri Valley. But let's look at their non-conference resumes and let's see how they stack up. And I was actually, I wouldn't say surprised because I've looked at this. I've gone on the Wikipedia page for this Wichita State team so many times, but that Wichita State team actually, for a team that plays in the Missouri Valley Conference, they went undefeated in a solid non-conference schedule. So here's what. Let me go through it. So I'm going to go by ESPN's bracketology to project potential seeds. But so San Diego State has a road win at BYU. BYU is projected as a 7. They're probably in that like 7 to 10 range. I would lean more towards like the 10. So they have a win at BYU. That's a good road win. They have a neutral win over Creighton, which is going to be a pretty solid win. Creighton's probably in that 5 to 8 range. And then they have a win over Iowa with Iowa also I would put in that 5 to 8, 9 range. So that is probably three wins over teams with. So there's 2 neutral wins over Creighton and Iowa, a win at BYU. Those are 3 teams that I would say are in the middle seed picture for the NCAA tournament in the non-conference. And then they have a neutral win over Utah. Utah's probably not making the tournament, but they did beat Kentucky. And on top of that, and this was, when I say they beat Kentucky, I mean they beat Utah a couple of days after Utah beat Kentucky. And then on top of that, they have 2 wins over Utah State. Utah State has solid metrics. Yeah, Utah State I think maybe 44th in Ken Palm. So let's say that Utah. I think Utah State doesn't make the tournament, but I do think they're like a first four out kind of situation, or not first 4 out, but they're in the bubble picture. Okay, so 3 wins over tournament teams and and a win over a bubble team. Okay. So that's San Diego State's resume. Not quite as impressive, nowhere near as impressive. I wouldn't say nowhere near, but not quite as impressive as Wichita State's. So Wichita State that year, they win at Tulsa. Tulsa was a 13 seed. They have a neutral win over DePaul. DePaul didn't make the tournament, but Big East team. They also ironically had a neutral win over also BYU, so both these teams had BYU, and BYU that year was a 10 seed. On top of that, this is where I think Wichita State's schedule benefited. They have a road win at St. Louis, and St. Louis that year ended up being a 5 seed. On top of that, they had a home win over Tennessee, an eventual 11 seed, a home win over North Carolina Central, eventual 16 seed, and then a road win at Alabama. Alabama didn't make the tournament that year, but they were a solid. I mean, they're an SEC team, so playing on the road at an SEC team is definitely helps your non-conference strength of schedule. Meanwhile, the difference is that Wichita State's conference was not as good. The second best team in their conference was Northern Iowa, who was 95th in Ken Palm that year. But just based on what I've seen in the eye test, I do think that if San Diego State is to enter the NCAA tournament undefeated, they would probably be the worst undefeated team I've seen between Wichita State and Kentucky. I do think they're worse than Wichita State, and that's not a knock on San Diego State. I mean, they've beaten whoever's in front of them. So they've obviously been one of the best teams in college basketball this year. But that's also why I wouldn't just pencil them into the second weekend. That's all I'm saying. I'm definitely planning on watching a couple more San Diego State games. I'm thinking probably they've played all the toughest games on their schedule already, and they got 5 games left before the Mountain West tournament. So I don't know. Definitely hoping to catch a San Diego State game or so. Ironically, I got to see Malachi Flynn this past summer. I didn't know much about him. I just knew he had transferred from Wazoo. But those are my thoughts on San Diego State. And obviously, as the closer they get to being undefeated heading into the tournament, there's going to be more discussion and revoking of teams like 2004 St. Joe's, who ended up with one loss. They lost in the conference tournament. And then obviously 2014 Wichita State and 2015 Kentucky. So I just think that's important to keep in mind. Their resume doesn't show quite as much as 2014 Wichita State. And I also don't think they have as many pros, or not pros. I don't think they're as talented as that 2014 Wichita State team, because 2014 Wichita State had Fred VanVleet, who ended up obviously balling out in this past NBA Finals. Ron Baker, who ended up getting drafted. Clee Anthony Early, who was a fringe first-round talent. And then a lot of really solid college players. Whereas I'm thinking when it comes to the San Diego State team, the best player, the guy who's got a shot at the NBA is probably Malachi Flynn. He could be a first-team All-American. Beyond that, I don't see them quite. In other words, I would take Baker, VanVleet, Clee Anthony Early, Shaquille Morris over that team, over this current San Diego State team. But that said, I'm really rooting for San Diego State to be undefeated heading into the NCAA tournament, because that would be a very interesting wrinkle to the tournament. The last thing I want to talk about is Kentucky. Now, they lost to Auburn, but they are 6-1 in their last 7 games, I believe, and they've won they've gotten some quality road wins recently. Obviously at Texas Tech, at Arkansas, and then a couple days ago at Tennessee. The team I want to compare this to, so there's been a lot of discussion. I feel like Kentucky, they have probably the worst losses for high major teams that are going to be safely in the field. Obviously, that loss to Evansville and then the loss to Utah doesn't help. And then at South Carolina at the buzzer, those losses don't help. But this team, resume-wise, reminds me a little bit of the 2015-16 team. And that was actually one of my favorite Kentucky teams. The team with Tyler Ulis and Jamal Murray. That team, and hear me out on this, they had both of these teams had wins in the Championship Classic over solid teams, but not like 1 seed, 2 seed level. The 2016 team beat Duke, and then this year's team beat Michigan State. I think Michigan State's going to be fine heading into the tournament. Then both of these teams had a couple ugly SEC, or not ugly, but had a bad SEC loss. Kentucky lost. This year's Kentucky team has obviously lost to South Carolina already. That SEC team, the 2016 team lost at Tennessee and Auburn and LSU, all three who missed the tournament. And back then Auburn was like in the 200s, I think, in KenPom. So not a great look. But both of these teams also lost to both of these teams also lost to Ohio State in the CBS Sports Classic. But the bottom line is that the 16 team entered the tournament as a 4 seed, and though they lost to Indiana, I thought they were a real threat to get to the Final Four. They were just a little too reliant on their guards, and unfortunately just lost in a very good game to Indiana. But both this current team and this team I'm referencing, the 2016 team, both of them had multiple really bad losses and not as many signature wins to balance it out. But that said, I do like the backcourt for this team. Obviously, you got the three-headed monster in Quickly, Higgins, and Tyrese Maxey. The 2016 team had the three-headed monster of Jamal Murray, Tyler Ulis, Isaiah Briscoe. Now, ironically, I think that this team actually has a potentially higher ceiling, because I think Nick Richards is going to be more not higher ceiling. I think this team might have better bigs than that previous team, because this team has Nick Richards, who is an SEC Player of the Year candidate, and I think Nate Sestina is better. He's more experienced than Derek Willis, who was on that previous team. Meanwhile, this current team has guys like Keon Brooks and Juzang and EJ Montgomery. But Juzang and Keon Brooks have been showing a little bit more promise recently. So with all that in mind, the thing is, Kentucky, because they have taken such ugly losses, I don't know if they can get past, like a 3 seed. similar to how maybe that previous Kentucky team was a little limited by their lack of by the fact that the SEC was down that year and they didn't get as many quality wins. But that said, that 2016 team was a 4 seed, and I thought was a real threat to get to the Final Four. And I'm gonna say that this team, I really do expect them to start clicking more and to. I mean, they kind of already are, but I really do expect them to be looking at their best in March. And I was gonna say, resume wise, they remind me a little bit of this 2016 team, but in terms and a little bit in terms of the play style, but I wouldn't be surprised if heading into the tournament they're a little bit like the 2018 team where they really start to look like they're figuring it out, and it looks like they found who their clear cut leader and go to guy in crunch time is, because sometimes I see Tyrese Maxey being that guy and sometimes I don't. And I know it's cliche and I'm sure it's been said a million times, but this team, when they look at their best, it's when Tyrese Maxey is absolutely going. All their best wins, Michigan State and Louisville, both come in those situations where Tyrese Maxey really has it going. So curious to watch this team. I love Tyrese Maxey. He is my favorite player to watch in college basketball this year, probably. So I will continue monitoring the Kentucky situation. But they have a couple more opportunities for some quality wins. I would say at LSU and home against Auburn are quality wins, and then Florida and at Florida are at least decent wins. So curious to monitor that. So we will see. That's about all I have for stuff today. So once again, thank you for listening. I'll catch you guys soon. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe on whatever medium you listen to, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or SoundCloud. And once again, I will catch you soon. Thank you guys.